Hello, hello. Welcome to Who's Views and another edition of Merchandise Paradise. And as you can see, I am joined by and delighted to welcome to Who's Views Merchandise Paradise writer, television producer, director. He's worked on such brilliant classic television shows as Top of the Pops, That's Life, there's a show, Going Live. And of course, he's probably best known as a former editor on the BBC's flagship, longest running television show, the legendary Blue Peter. It's Richard Marson. Hello.
Hello, hi, how are you?
I am smashing and I am thrilled to have you here on Merchandise Paradise. Thank you so much for finding some time to join me. It's
My
great
pleasure.
to see you. So we are here today to talk about these wonderful books that you've got out with 10 Acre Films,
Yeah.
which I called the trilogy, Richard, to be honest, because
My
what we've got,
babies, my
they are
babies,
your babies.
two children. Yes.
We're going to be talking.
There they are.
We're going to be talking about the Verity Lambert book. We're going to be then going over to talk about the John Nathan Turner book. And we are going to be talking about the Biddy Baxter book. Lots to get in there, lots to talk about. But first of all, I want to actually ask you, Richard, is it true that by winning one of the legendary and now iconic Blue Peter badges in 1972, that kick-started your career into television?
No, it didn't. I got mugged in the playground, and that badge didn't last very long. You know, there was they had such currency. You know, I took it to school, and that was a really silly thing to do. But
Yeah.
no, at the moment, I can tell you exactly the moment. I was in the sixth form at school and skiving off. I should have been revising, and I was watching Blue Peter. In those days, there were only 3 channels. So I was watching Blue Peter, and it was an edition going behind the scenes on Janet Ellis's first day. So it showed you how the program worked, and Biddy was there, and of course all the other people. And I just thought then it was like a light bulb moment. I'd love to do that job, and almost exactly 20 years later, I got the job. So that's kind of really weird, isn't it? Because you know that doesn't often happen.
It doesn't often happen, and good for you for making it happen. I also remember that edition behind the scenes with Janet's first edition of the show, and it was brilliant, wasn't it? It really did give you a unique insight. People these days don't understand because you get to see sort of these things all the time, but back in the day, nothing like that was ever happened unless you got the odd thing on Swap Shop or whatever.
I
It was
have a
thrilling.
theory. I have a theory that Blue Peter invented modern television. I mean, an
Oh,
awful lot of the kind of not just the items or the subject matter, but sometimes the way that they broke the fourth wall and the way that they would go out and they would show children how they would deconstruct it. And I think that was happening way before live Saturday evening shows and, you know, prank shows and things like that. You know, there's a lot of shows that owe a lot to Blue Peter, I think.
Oh, I totally agree with it. And for anybody that's watching outside the United Kingdom and thinking, what is Blue Peter? Don't you worry. We're going to be educating you all on that. Plus, it's very special relationship with our very own Doctor Who during this show. Now, I have to also point out, Richard, you are one of us. You are a Doctor Who fan, aren't you?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Like, I mean, I think growing up, my generation, you know, you grew up with. It was almost like you were educated by Blue Peter, entertained by, you know, Basil Brush and Top of the Pops. And in terms of drama or thrills, Doctor Who was front and center. So there were certain shows that I think everybody of my generation bought into. Of course, what happens when you become a fan, like I'd lost interest in it around about 1977, 78. But I came back to it when I was about 14 or 15. And that's the kind of probably, you know, when the geeky teenager syndrome. And suddenly I realized that it wasn't just a show that I liked. It had all this history and it had all these connections to other things. And that was really what drew me in.
Yeah. And that's great. When you finally got to start your career within the BBC, did you ever get on set or anything like that? Did you ever manage to do anything?
Oh, yeah. Well, for Doctor Who, yeah. I mean, I was working for Doctor Who magazine from the age of kind of 17. And that meant sometimes officially they would arrange a set visit and I would go up for things like Resurrection of the Daleks. Sometimes it was unofficial. Someone would get you in on their pass and you would watch it from the viewing gallery being recorded. I mean, I saw tons and tons of seasons kind of 20, 21, 22, a little bit less 23. By the time we were getting to Sylvester, I wasn't so interested, but I was still going. So, you know, there was, I saw a lot of it and some location filming too.
Yeah, and I seem to think you may have visited the set of Dragonfire.
Yes, yeah, Dragonfire was an official visit. That was there. I am, yeah, taken by Steve Cook, I think, from Doctor Who magazine, and I was there to interview Sophie and probably Sylvester. Yeah, that was fun. That was about the last really good fun memory I've got of Doctor Who in that era. I mean, it was not a loved show in the BBC. And Doctor Who fans were not loved either by the Doctor Who production office or by the BBC. He was seen as a pain in the bum, and some of us were, and maybe that was just the way it was. But I do think that you have your time. And now looking back, we know that behind the scenes, John Nathan Turner was desperately fighting to sort of save the show and keep the show on air, and the BBC just weren't really very interested. So it did have that slight air of desperation about it, and money was so bad. I mean, they just didn't have the money to even put decent sets up. So in fact, the inventiveness, the creativity of the designers and the some of the directors and things to try to do what they did, I mean, a lot of other people would probably have done a lot worse. So there was a lot of creativity going on, but it was just frustrating to watch a show that was sort of being allowed to bleed to death.
Yeah, it must have been actually, especially when you could see behind the scenes then, you were hearing all those stories that were going on at the TV Centre at the time. We'll come to looking at your time researching that in the John Nathan Turner era when we talk about the John Nathan Turner book. But I do want to go, and we'll start now with the Verity Lambert book, if we may, because this book has been acclaimed. It's a great seller. It's one of these books that you have to order at certain times as well, because it just sells so quickly. The Life and Legacy of Verity Lambert. Now, as Doctor Who fans, we all know Verity Lambert. I mean, Verity was an incredible woman. She was an original, she set the standard for women that came after her, as well as men as well, because she really revolutionized television. What was it about this whole story that attracted you to writing the book?
I think I'd done the John Nathan Turner book, who was the last producer of kind of classic Doctor Who. And it was the publisher. The publisher said, what about doing kind of the first producer? And of course, really, that's just a chapter. What was so intriguing about Verity was that she'd done Doctor Who as a very, very young fledgling producer, woman producer at a time when there were so few women doing those kind of jobs. And talk about take the ball and run with it. Not only had she had an enormous success with Doctor Who and got it off to a kind of flying start against the odds. I mean, not many people thought it was going to go anywhere or do anything. Yeah. Probably why she was allowed to do it. But, she had this huge success. And then she was like a heat-seeking missile in the industry. She just went from show to show. And I think her talent was extraordinary, and her ability to put projects together. She was a true producer. I think she knew her limits. She wasn't someone who was going to get sidetracked by thinking, I want to write a script or direct a movie or whatever. She was a person who put talent together. And if you look at her track record, the daunting thing about doing that book was just sort of thinking, there's so much. How do you kind of boil that down and do justice to? I mean, I knew I wanted to give a whole chapter to El Dorado, mainly because that was sort of the only blot on her copybook, and it's fascinating as to why that show so could have worked and nearly did, and if it had, that it would still be running now. And it was a good idea. It was a clever idea, but she just at that point in her life, she took her eye off the ball because of the stuff going on in her private life, and that was a disaster because in the wake of that, as we know, lots of silly decisions were made. There was all sorts of egos going on, and the show kind of died on its arse. But that was very interesting, that in all this gallery of success, there was this one clunker. And then the final thing I'd say is that I loved her bravery. So the end of her life, the last few years of her life, when she was dealing with cancer, but she was indefatigable. She wouldn't give up. She was still doing Jonathan Creek and Love Soup and, like wearing a wig to cover up the fact she'd lost her hair and going into the edit. And it talked about eyes and teeth. I mean, she was a trooper, and there was so much to admire.
When you were compiling all this, the book, and you were starting to research everything, obviously as a Doctor Who fan, you were going to get to Doctor Who, and you were going to look at that. Was there anything that you found out that you weren't aware of at the time as a fan?
I think that I just knew that when you approach it, I was very keen with John Nathan Turner to do. I felt there hadn't been a biography in the Doctor Who sort of non-fiction book area that really dealt with people as adults and as how grown-ups in show business are, which is often tricky and often, you know, with all sorts of politics and egos going on. And that I knew from my own experience with the BBC, I'd lived that life. And I sort of thought it was time that someone tried to put Doctor Who under that kind of analysis. So rather than it being a mixture of sort of fan love and fan myth, that you were trying to drill into what were the real pressures on these people, what was actually going on, were some of these things authentic, what was it actually like? And so the same thing applied with Verity. When you go right back to the beginning of Doctor Who, you know, here she was. We now know, because it was a success, that kind of defines what history tells you. But it so nearly could have been a disaster, and her career could have been a one-line CV. You know, when you think about what she was up against and the kind of, you know, the pipe-smoking, tweedy-suited, you know, that like Rex Tucker, you know, who was supposed to be one of the early directors, and Peter I can't say it, Peter Brachacki, I think, the first designer. You know, they treated her as though she was an irrelevance. And I mean, Biddy, Freudian slip. Verity, they shared a similar thing here. They were not going to be put down by any man anywhere or patronized. But I think there was that kind of fight. And that was really interesting to think what a struggle it was to get that show up and running.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to look at the fact that the times here are incredible. We are looking at 1960s Britain. Women aren't being treated in a way that is responsible. They're not being looked at as serious. And here come, and it's the same with Biddy, who we'll get to as well. Here come these two very strong, determined women who are going to do a job, and they really shake up the culture. Was there anything that you found out about how Verity dealt with the BBC at the time, with the fact that she was surrounded, as you say, by all these men that were just writing her off? I'm trying to be terribly politically correct, you can see.
Well, I think Not For Nothing was one of her nicknames, Hurricane Verity. And in exactly the same way as Biddy and Esther Ranson and Julia Smith and some of the other kind of standout women of those days of television, they had to be feisty and they had to be really tough. And that meant that there was a lot of swearing, a lot of drinking, a lot of smoking, not in Biddy's case, but they all were quite hard-edged women. And I think that not only did they have to be, they weren't thinking in terms of being pioneering feminists. I really don't think that. I think they were getting on and dealing with the situation that they'd been handed. They were ambitious, they were super bright and all of that. And I think they weren't above, you know, using their sexuality if necessary to, you know, flutter the eyelids or show a bit of leg or whatever. But there's a big difference between that and then going any further than that. And as you know, one of the things I wanted to kind of drill into was, did Verity get the job because she was sleeping with the boss? Various people said to me who were around at the time, absolutely, she was Sidney Newman's mistress, blah, blah, blah. But you know what? In the end, you put all the evidence together and you have to allow the reader and yourself to make the call on whether you think that's true or not. And I just never believed that. I thought she was far too intelligent, and someone, and it was the men who generally said that, and the female friends and colleagues who said, no. Not only was Verity too bright, the other thing is to think about is that as soon as you have the affair has its shelf life. And then after that, usually the two people don't want to be anywhere near each other. Sidney Newman adored Verity his whole life. I think there was a paternal edge there as well. I think there was definitely some flirty, you know, all of that, a few glasses of wine. But I absolutely just couldn't find it credible that she would have been so gauche somehow to have had an affair with him. And I think that it didn't happen. But I do think that he really, really believed in her. And I think she used his name, to kind of propel herself forward. And why not?
Well, absolutely. When you've got that business contact as part of networking, you use it, don't you? Absolutely. I mean, as fans, we know that.
I mean, can I just say, I was never in my career, you know, I would have loved to have been able to flash a bit of leg or, you know, but sadly, no one was ever interested. So, you know, it's kind of, and I think you use what you've got, you know, like whether it's a bit of charm, a bit of, I've known people who were terrifying, like producers back in the day, like Michael Hurl, who ran Top of the Pops.
Yes.
He was a brilliant director, an amazing producer, but absolutely terrifying. And I think otherwise, he probably decided he had to be like that, because if you looked at him, he looked like a bank clerk, So,
well, spot him out of a load of BBC people at the time, really. But there you go, all controversial. We're talking there about Verity. As Doctor Who fans, we are told, we are aware that Sydney Newman was never very happy with her approach when it came to the look of the Daleks and including the Daleks into Doctor Who. But it was those episodes that actually cemented, of course, the huge popularity of the show in the United Kingdom, and the ratings did soar. We know that. That's fact. From what you found out when you're writing about her, did that make life easier for her within the BBC and within the industry?
Absolutely. I mean, nothing succeeds like success. And once you're getting 13 million viewers for a children's show that has been given a risible budget and put into the most shockingly badly equipped studio the BBC then had to offer, the irony of them wanting this futuristic show and putting it in a studio that was really not fit for purpose. I think for her to get those kind of figures, and don't forget, the BBC would always judge success not just on audience figures, but on what they called audience appreciation, the AI, the audience index. And the approval of the audience was through the roof. Suddenly, merchandising deals, which was quite unusual for a BBC show, very unusual for a BBC show, they were mounting up and making the corporation plenty of extra money. I mean, what's not to love? She had a success and she knew precisely how to use that. And she continued to do that. That was the sensible thing to do. And, she was also very aware you're only as big as your last hit. So there's this constant hustle. I don't think after the Daleks and getting into the second season of Doctor Who, she then very clearly wanted to get out before it went stale and before it was a case of repeating. In fact, John Nathan Turner could really have learned from that example that, especially in drama, don't linger, don't get stuck. You need to make a splash and then move on to the next thing. And that's what she wanted to do.
I mean, I was going to ask you about this particular point as well, because that's one of the things I always admire about Verity. She gave the BBC a monster hit and then moves on and then becomes a monster hit herself. Now, obviously, that must have been a really difficult career decision for her to make. Her baby, as it were.
I don't think so.
Right, brilliant. I was going to ask, did you think that?
No.
Or
I don't. I think first of all you have to remember that in 1965, she'd done it for a couple of years, backbreakingly hard work, still no money. Still, she wanted to do more prestigious work. She was furious when they tried to put her onto a soap, and she very grudgingly did the first few episodes of The Newcomers. And she'd already turned down another soap that was a disaster. She didn't want to be that person. She wanted to get into the high-end drama. She wanted to work with the top people, hugely to her credit, she tried to get top directors to work on Doctor Who. And of course, they just turned their nose up and said, there is no way. She had great creative aspirations. So I think she was more than ready to go on. What I do think is that she always had a genuine fondness for Doctor Who, not least because of what it did for her. It was her launch pad. And I think she kind of, always kept a sideways eye on it, as it went on. In a way, that's a continuing nod to you, isn't it? That if a show is going into its 10th, 11th, 12th season, and it's the show you launched, that's still something you can claim the credit for. And I know that she didn't take she wasn't very pleased with the John Pertwee take on Doctor Who.
Well, that's famous with those fans, isn't it? Yeah.
And she loved the fact that it was, that it was ongoing. And, she even made a kind of half-hearted bid for it in the indie days. But I think she did always care about it.
Yeah, and as fans, we know that. She was quite honest when she talked about the Pertwee. She was also very honest about the later 80s. Let's face that, and we'll be coming to that shortly. Of course,
all I would say about the later 80s is that that's sort of like slightly like playground bullying, because the show was struggling and the show was on its uppers, and there were a lot of industry figures who were quite happy to go and have a pop and slate it and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, well, it's all relative. You know, John Nathan Turner was dealing in budget terms with a show that hadn't evolved much beyond what Verity was trying to deal with. And if you look at the rest of 80s drama, 80s drama, even things like EastEnders, were being properly budgeted, whereas Doctor Who was still being treated, even though it was earning huge amounts of money for the BBC, it was treated like the kind of unwanted child at the table.
Yeah, and that does run through all this. I mean, the parallels between the two books that you've written here about Verity and about John. I mean, yes, you mentioned it's great that you've got a beginning and the end, really, for the original series. You know, you've got those bookends. I love that, and I love the way that you've produced those. But in all three books, really, because they're all dealing within the BBC, when you read the three books, you actually do realise that some things never actually really change that quickly.
Absolutely. Well, the French have a phrase for it, don't they? The more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think,
but you were in on this as well. You could see this firsthand.
I mean, I think the thing is, having longed to work for the BBC, and then I've spent most of my career, even as working for an independent, as I've done for the last 12 years. Most of the shows that I've been working on are still shows that end up on the BBC. So you're working within BBC rules and dealing with BBC politics and BBC, you know, the ebb and flow of what's going on in the BBC. And I'm old enough now to have seen things that, you know, were proposed when I was kind of in my 20s are back now. I'm in my 50s and they're being presented as a new idea. And you're sort of thinking, well, you know, there are only so many kind of ideas and takes on this. And the BBC's a as everyone will tell you, it's almost impossible not to have a love-hate relationship with the BBC, because it's incredible that something like the BBC exists. We're so privileged to have it. But on the other hand, it's absolutely its own worst enemy. And the BBC is a collection of people, so that as Verity found it, as John found it, and certainly as Biddy and I found it, a lot of whether things go well or not depends on the caliber of the people, not just that you're working with or who are working to you, but who are above you. And if the people above you are not much cop, then it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think, John Nathan Turner sort of had that problem. I certainly had that problem. Biddy, towards the end of her time, had that problem where, if management have lost interest in your show, there's almost nothing you can do, because in the end, they're not going to give it the shot window. They're not going to push it. They're not going to promote it. And that has a kind of a horrible, insidious effect on everyone.
Again, as Doctor Who fans, what you've just said there, we can actually see, can't you? Because there were some management figures, sixth floor figures at the BBC that loved it, were aware of what it was. They may not have pushed it as much, but they supported it. It was still on.
Yeah, I mean, they never gave it more money.
No.
I think there was always that joke, wasn't there, that people like Bill Cotton or Hugh Weldon, who loved the Daleks, they never updated their settings. They never thought, well, actually, this show is great. It does really good. Let's give it another 10% of money. So I think even though there were a few of the Turks who liked the show,
yes,
they didn't put their money where their mouth was. And then later on, of course, it was a procession of suits who really didn't care for it at all. They found it embarrassing. It was very similar to Crossroads at ITV. So Crossroads was very cheap, did huge numbers in terms of audiences, brought the kind of audiences, the C's and the D's, that nowadays people would be crying out to attract. But in those days, we're all very snobby. Oh, we don't want these working class housewives and things watching, our wonderful channel. And they got rid of Crossroads. And really, it was exactly the same as Doctor Who. It got kind of progressively diminished and run down and cut back. And yet nowadays they would be killing for a show like that.
Well, and that's certainly its ratings, absolutely, because the ratings that you guys were all getting in production at the time are a dream now, aren't they? And yes, people can argue the
competition, of course. You have to remember that. People on TikTok nowadays. You're competing with TikTok and YouTube. You're not even competing with other channels. You're competing.
No, you're true, because I know I totally agree. People are always saying, well, the platforms have changed, but there are times when I do look at certain shows that people will you will have the bum on seats effect. There are certain guys that, hang on a minute, that got 9 million. So it shows sometimes.
There's no doubt about it that Russell T Davies, one of the genius aspects of him, is that at a time when everybody was saying there is no way that a Saturday evening show can get a huge family audience, well, surprise, surprise, you know, and I still believe it's like when people used to tell me magazine shows don't work anymore. They, you know, audiences now don't want a magazine show. You're like, oh, really? And suddenly the one show is getting 5 million viewers. And for the record, I think the one show is pretty shockingly shit a lot of the time. But in terms of the audience's appetite for a cozy magazine show that ticks all the boxes, that has guests on, that has films about what's going on in the UK, whether it's nationwide or people that, you know, do not diss your own audience. And so often that's what happens. And Russell T, he loves television. He's a proper fan. So going back to the fan thing, I think the people that make the best television are fans of television because they know what they look for in a show. And they know that things like the attention to detail, the little nods to the past that you can or can't get, those things matter. They really do.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. This is the difference we've got here as well, because through such legendary and iconic British shows as Doctor Who and Blue Peter, I've often said you can actually see the progression in the industry, in the technology through both shows, the changes that are coming through, the generational changes that people are bringing. But it's all based on those templates that people like Verity put into place, Biddy put into place. It's all there. It's all built. The foundations are built, and you can actually see. You've mentioned there, you know, about the love of television that comes in really with, I reckon, around about the same time Peter Davison gets into Doctor Who. The first generation that grew up watching telly, understanding that television is more than the four walls of the theatre.
The best example of that probably is John Nathan Turner's killing off of Adric and the silent credits, which he nicked from Coronation Street in the death of
He
Marson.
did, yeah.
You know, so I mean, JNT was a massive telly fan, and he was a lowbrow TV fan, like you know, the best of us. He wasn't snobby. You know, he liked Crossroads, he liked Top of the Pops, he liked those sort of shows, and therefore, when he was running Doctor Who, I mean, arguably, you know, books have been written and endless amounts of thousands of words have been expounded on, you know, was John Nathan Turner wrong on Doctor Who? You know, was he too Ellie? Blah, blah, blah. But actually, some of his instincts were so ahead of the curve, you know, like casting famous people in unlikely parts, you know, whether you like it or not, that was a clever thing to do.
Yeah. Well, we'll start talking about this now, because you are known for this book as well. We've got The Totally Tasteless: The Life of John Nathan Turner. Fans have been talking about this for a long time now. You can now get it again from www.10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. Another great book for you here, Richard. Was it the fact that the elements you've just spoken about John, was it that attracted you to actually get in there and find out a little bit more about him and write this biography about him?
Well, I did know quite a bit about him, and quite a bit of that hadn't really been in the public domain or talked about. And I had enormous sympathy for him, or empathy for him, in various ways. You know, I think he was deeply flawed, but I don't think that's unusual in our industry, or in fact in life. I mean, you know, I think good people do terrible things and make mistakes, and I think he was no different in a way. I do subscribe to the view that his biggest problem was his partner, who I thought was a toxic person really, and had a bad effect on John. But you know, John as a person, he could be so charming and so fun and, you know, very generous, I think, and kind. And, you know, nowadays he'd be cancelled in a heartbeat because people would say, oh, he's inappropriate or he crossed lines. And there's no doubt that by our standards, 21st century standards, he did. But that was the other thing I wanted to do, was go back and reconstruct the context in which he was working and living, so that you can put all the judgment you want from 2021 or whenever the book first came out. But in fact, what matters is, how was he in the context of his time? And I think, you know, by and large, he came out of it much better than a lot of people were expecting. You know, people thought I was going to be writing this thing, which was, you know, trying to kind of put him in the same bracket as Jimmy Savile or whatever. And, you know, absolutely, in fact, the opposite was the case, because there'd always been rumors about John. And there were unsavory sides of the way that he behaved, and he did abuse his position at times. But he was not a malignant, you know, he wasn't this kind of creepy criminal at all. Not as far as I ever found out.
Yeah, and I think that's important that you've actually said that as well, because when the book was first released, well, there were certain tabloids, surprise, surprise, that took elements of your book out and made it completely sensational. What was your reaction to suddenly seeing all this work you've poured into this book in these? I mean, and I know you know the tabloids. I know you've worked with the tabloids. I know you know how they. But what was your reaction to going? What is this?
It was weird, really, because me and the publisher, we'd sort of, I mean, maybe there was a naivety in that I honestly didn't think when I was writing it that any national newspaper would take the slightest interest in a fairly niche story about a Doctor Who producer who'd been long dead even by that point. So, you know, I was a kind of, but then of course what happened was the Savile thing happened. And what you have to bear in mind is that the tabloid agenda is largely how can we throw mud at the BBC? So this just felt for them like another opportunity to construct stories that said the BBC was a hotbed of paedophiles or terrible people or whatever. And it was tricky because you make these things up as you go along. You know, it's a niche publisher. It's not Penguin. And even if it had been Penguin and you'd had a press officer or something, they'd all be scrabbling around thinking, well, how do you manage this? I mean, we took a few decisions that I felt were really the right ones. We turned down a lot of money. I would have made way more money if I'd said yes to the Daily Mail, who offered us a deal to run extracts. And, oh, surprise, surprise, can we guess which bits they'd have lifted out? And neither I nor the publisher wanted to do that. And so it was a bit galling when you kind of got slated by some people who said, oh, they knew exactly what they were doing and they were deliberately kind of going out there to get all this. Because if we wanted to do that, we would have been a lot wealthier as a consequence. And I think the other thing that's probably was always annoying was that we were landed with the title. I never liked the title of the first edition. It was called The Life and Scandalous Times of John Nathan Turner.
Yeah.
And I had been in a to and fro with the original publisher who pulled out because they didn't like any of my original suggestions. So, you know, we had to come up with a title. And so I think that's never satisfactory when, you know, I don't know that they were that happy with it. I wasn't that happy with it, but you needed something. And I think in the end, that probably didn't help either. But, you know, the thing about these things is the circus quickly moves on. And what was good was that, you know, a few months down the line when people had actually read the book, I mean, there was an enormous amount of shocked of Shepton Mallet from people who hadn't actually read it. And I mean, there was this review in The Guardian that was terribly prissy and holier than thou. It was sort of saying, oh, you know, it's terribly shocking. But it was really, even though it was The Guardian, it was still only focused on, you know, 2 paragraphs in the book, really. And, you know, as I say, the British are obsessed with sex and kind of class and things like that. So I suppose it's no great surprise that that's where people would go to. And they were elements that were important parts of the story. You know, you can't separate. That was the other thing is if you're a biographer, you don't just pick the bits that suit the rosy view you want. Well, not in my book. No. I have seen other Doctor Who biographies that, frankly, I wouldn't wipe my bum with because, you know, they are basically exercises in, you know, self-delusion, I guess. And they're not really telling you anything and they're not being very honest and they're not trying to kind of get the diversity of opinion. I mean, when I look back at the John Nathan Turner book, I think I went too far that way. There are great sections. Yeah, absolutely. I think there are great sections of it where you could probably have edited it and boiled it down. But I think I was so aware that I didn't want to editorialize too much that I allowed quotes to ramble on too much. And he said this, she said this, he said this. Now that's useful in terms of you've got now a legacy. A lot of those people have died since. So you've got first-hand accounts from a lot of people, but probably in terms of the skill of the writing and the way that it reads, it could all have been tightened up.
As a Doctor Who fan, a long-standing Doctor fan, you are one of us. I like to say that because, you know, some of these people won't know you, they may not have seen you before, so you are a fan. Was there anything about putting this particular volume together where you genuinely did think, A, I didn't know about this element, or B, is this going to harm fandom?
I never for one moment thought that it would harm fandom in any way. I mean, it's the old Oscar Wilde line, isn't it? There's only one thing worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. I mean, you know, the thing is that I thought it was a piece of work that would stand hopefully alongside other bits of work on the series, where you're actually learning something and you're getting, perhaps talking to people who haven't been talked to before, but also asking some of the usual suspects, questions that they hadn't been asked before, trying different angles, so you get something kind of fresher and perhaps more real. I mean, I think it's interesting that people said to me, oh, one or two of the actors didn't like it very much. And I was like, well, maybe, but I was guided very much by people who were really close to John. I mean, it's all very well being in his cast and doing 2 or 3 seasons for him as he's your boss and you get on fine, but they didn't really socialize together beyond work. And they certainly didn't stick around when John was in his declining years. But people like Fiona Cumming and Ian Fraser and Stephen Cranford and people like that who were genuinely in the domestic day-to-day, and they were there for years and they were stalwart, loyal friends. The fact that they said to me, you've got this right. Some of it is uncomfortable, but we think you fairly and accurately caught John and how he was and how Gary was and what the issues were. That meant more to me than some actor being pissy about it because, he's worried he's going to get asked awkward questions on the convention circuit. I mean, who cares, But you have to remember with actors, it's all about them.
I'm glad you said that.
Name of the game, isn't it? And I know actually I should be fair to say there are exceptions to that, but by and large, I remember I thought it was very interesting, very revealing that Peter Davison once said that he was surprised that John Nathan Turner merited an obituary in a serious newspaper, and I thought that comment tells you quite a lot.
It really, really does, doesn't it? So again, when you're looking at the whole book in where you are now and you're looking at this, and again, we're going to show this, Totally Tasteless is available now from 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. It's back on the circuit again. Very striking cover as well, Richard, after the man himself there, really.
Brilliant, Stuart Manning. He's a really good designer.
We have to big up Stuart on that one, because it does actually scream JNT when you look at that. I mean, come on, from what we all know about John, I mean, it does say, yes, this is a book about John. When you look at it now, though, with the ability at any point to adapt for an updated edition, are you really happy? Are you still happy with this? Are you standing by everything that's in it?
Well, I think, like I said, I mean, if I was to kind of do a top-to-toe revision, I'd probably be cutting rather than adding. What's that phrase they have about kill your darlings? There are definitely sections where it rambles on a bit for my liking. But what I am proud of is that I don't think it's been superseded, and I don't think there's been any great further revelation. I think sort of what there is to say about John Nathan Turner, you can find in that book, and you're probably not going to find out a whole lot else that's not repetition or just further illustrations of the same point. I feel like it kind of did its job, and therefore it stood the test of time. And I have so much affection for John. We went on to make the film. Chris Chapman basically adapted the biography into a documentary for the Blu-ray range, and I was the consultant on that. And Chris and I worked closely together, and obviously that had to be quite, had to be tactful around some of the things that were a bit too adult for a doc that you might be watching if you were a 10-year-old or whatever. But nonetheless, that gave me a kind of renewed connection with John. And I have a lot of time for him. And there was a lot about him that was very admirable and likable.
Did you meet him when you were working at the BBC yourself, when your career was really taken off? Yeah.
I mean, when I was writing on Doctor Who magazine, he had the famous blue pencil. And he would phone the news. I was at university at the time in Durham, and we had one payphone on the wall along the corridor from our rooms. It was that I'm that old, and so very analog, darling. And the phone would ring, and I'd usually be asleep because I'd have been up most of the night doing nefarious things, but also working. I often used to do a lot of the writing in the early hours and on my Amstrad, and then I'd fax it off to Marvel from pronto print in the high street, and then go back to bed. And anyway, someone would knock on my door and say, Marson, there's this woman on the phone from the BBC, and it would be Sarah Lee, John's secretary.
Yeah,
and it would be snippy because he'd been kept waiting, and then John would come on the line and go, "Hi, how are you?"
Yeah.
And then he'd give you the news. The Reign of Terror, episode 6 has been found, and blah, 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 you know. And I'd be writing it on my hand, writing it on the wall, you know, and then I'd go and type it up. And if he didn't like something, he absolutely would snip it or make comments. I mean, I remember doing an article about fantasy males, which was basically a list, you know, going through of any of the, and we did fantasy females too.
I remember these actually, yeah.
Nowadays, you need to do fantasy gender fluid. You know, in those days, it was males and females. There was nothing else. But anyway, we did this. You know, it was daft. It was a filler. These were the days when the show had been postponed. So I was having to write 40,000 words a month with very little access to any research material or the rest of it. So you were basically waffling for money. And then I did this thing, and he phoned me up and he said, "This fantasy males piece," he said, "keep it clean, all right?" And I was thinking, what does he think I'm going to write? It's Doctor Who magazine, not Playboy. I mean, you know, it really, really made me laugh. And sometimes I couldn't work out whether he was being tongue in cheek or whether he was being literal. But you know, and he was very cat and mouse, because ultimately you were a barker. You know, you were what he and Gary called a barker, a mad fan.
A fan, yeah.
And, I mean, you know, I think he quite didn't mind me, but you know, I think, and he was very unkind sometimes about some of the other Doctor Who fans who were perhaps a little less fetching to look at. But you know, he was ultimately a fan himself. I mean, John was a fan, and he was a fan of Doctor Who, and you know, I think perhaps that was one of the problems, that there was a degree of, you know, kind of contempt for himself in all of this, rather than nowadays you can absolutely be open. I mean, all the parallels with sexuality really abound, you know, like in those days, people were more so. And ironically, John was a proud out gay man. Yeah. He never made any bones about that. Huge round of applause for the fact that, you know, even within show business, that didn't always make things easy. And it was interesting that some of the comments I picked up from snootier senior management about John had a homophobic tinge to them. They would say something like, "Oh, we never quite liked the way he dressed. It was all very vulgar." And you're like, who cares how somebody dressed if they're delivering the goods, you know? So John had, you know, but curiously, he had this thing of, I think maybe he was self-conscious about the fact that actually he was a fan of the show he was making.
Yeah. I think there's something in that. But you know, here he is doing the show, and he was so protective. We all know that. I mean, he did it. Back to your point earlier on, he did it, and he admitted this towards the end of his life. He did it too long.
Yeah,
but there were reasons.
I mean,
there were reasons for that. Well,
yeah, I mean, you know, like if someone's saying to you, it's either do another series of that or you have no job.
Yeah.
And also, John was very unlucky to be caught up in the changing of the industry, so that the industry was moving over to a completely different model, particularly in drama. Everything was becoming independent productions. Everyone was becoming freelancer. And he fell between, you know, he fell beneath the slats. I mean, he could have worked very successfully on a soap opera, but nobody wanted him because Doctor Who was a poison chalice.
Yeah.
He'd been there a very long time. He was seen as a one-trick pony with a one-line CV. And the industry is very unforgiving. It was unforgiving then, it's unforgiving now. So people who had reinvented themselves, like say Matthew Robinson, who'd become a producer, an executive producer, they just didn't want to take the risk of taking John on. And that's not, I mean, I don't mean to single him out, but it was a reflection of how the industry itself had sort of moved on and John had missed the bus.
Yeah. And it's no secret, and he would admit this himself, wouldn't he? He did struggle. He tried to get jobs at what was then BBC Worldwide, producing those spin-off Doctor Who videos. That didn't go anywhere. From your point of view, I've always wanted to ask you, Richard, from your point of view.
Sorry, I should just say, to be fair, he did that for about 3 years and it paid the bills. I think the problem was that, you know, it was kind of flogging a dead horse in the end. So I think it would have been probably very depressing for him.
Yeah, that's more or less what I meant. It wouldn't have gone anywhere for John, really, because he knew what he was doing, and they became very samey, didn't they, for him? I think that would have frustrated him, because he was very creative as well, wasn't he? He had all these wonderful ideas that nobody picked up.
He had great stunt ideas. He was great.
That's a nice way to put that.
Yeah, I mean, he was great at those things that would get the show attention, and where his biggest Achilles heel was not trusting some of the creatives around him, and therefore having a tendency to put people in place who were mates, who he felt cozy with and who he could control. And I understand that, because if you're running a big show, sometimes you think, well, so-and-so, like say Peter Moffat, he's a lovely man, everyone likes him, he'll get the show done on time and on budget, and he's always fun to go out to lunch with. That is not the best reason for choosing a director on a show. And his better directors tended not to last because they were spikier and more difficult and more challenging. And he didn't like to be threatened. So I think he could be his own worst enemy creatively. And he absolutely had zero script sense. I mean, I honestly don't think he really understood narrative at all.
Yeah. And there's lots of people that, of course, are on film, on camera, that would agree with that as well. One of the things
all I would just quickly say on that is, obviously, as they used to say, history is written by the survivors. And Eric Sayward has had many, many, many opportunities to go at John Nathan Turner posthumously, but he was pretty shoddy, if I'm honest. I mean, I found plenty. I remembered at the time he was never around, all of that. I think the thing is that he's obviously very angry and bitter about what happened with his career and blames John Nathan Turner for that. But ultimately, you look at what he was doing and some of the stuff he was turning out or passing as fit for transmission. Whatever he says about, it was his job to get the writers, to brief the writers, to script edit the show. And, I think a lot of the time he was only really interested in what he was doing on his stuff. And he stayed too long as well.
Absolutely. I mean, what comes through, not just through our chat just now, but also through your writing, is you look at these elements of the industry and in particular, I'm going to say it, in particular, the BBC as it was. And you came into this. You came into the BBC as it was beginning to become aware of certain government of the day dictates, the fact that things were developing with technology, things were going to happen when it came to changing the landscape of broadcasting. Were you aware of the sixth floor being aware of these changes? Because what comes through on our chat here is that they didn't really change. They were all the very, stiff upper lip, suited guys of a certain age, all the way through the sixth floor. Verity encountered them. John had to encounter them. They were writing off certain things. They thought they knew their market. It's very questionable, from my opinion, whether or not they did back then. But that's just my opinion. But, were you aware, or was there anything happening at the BBC that were the sixth floor threatened? Were they going with these changes, or was there a resolute, hang on. Do you think they were aware that their industry was changing and broadcasting was going to change and that they had to change with it?
I think that you have to always remember that the BBC is really based on a civil service model. And rather like the civil service, you have a lot of kind of people in the system who are not program makers, who are not creative, and in fact have an instinctive mistrust for the creative side of it. There's always in the BBC the push-pull between the management and the creatives. And the management think the creatives are all like untrustworthy, spend too much money, come up with mad ideas, not really controllable or accountable. And they're right about some of those things, but you can't run a television company without those people. And the management side of things is seen by the creatives as safe, bureaucratic, often missing the wood for the trees, inhuman sometimes. I mean, during the John Birt era, people just felt that management didn't care at all about the human cost of making these radical changes. I don't think they did care very much, to be honest. It was an academic exercise because that's what was coming from him, from the top. You did get some good people who got up there, but I was always very suspicious of management if they had absolutely no experience of making any kind of content. To be told by someone who's, worked in a property portfolio or been, number crunching in some business part of the BBC and doing budgets, and then they suddenly start taking an interest in the editorial, you think, well, I don't really trust your view. I don't. How are you qualified? I'd rather hear what the audience have got to say in a way. And the other problem is inevitably it's Oxbridge, public school. I mean, I can talk white male. What do they call it? Pale, male, and stale.
Certainly not stale.
Obviously, yes, quite. Obviously, two of those things, but not the third. but there was that sort of sameness or cliqueiness of type, and I think also they were very good at reading reports saying, "Oh, this big new technology is coming," or this competition's on the way, and they'd say, "Oh, we've got to be much more competitive. We've got to be." But sometimes that would mean that terrible acts of vandalism would happen. They would rush into making decisions about. I will finish with I think the biggest example of where management consistently went awry at the BBC was that there was always some colossal vanity building project. No matter how up against it you were with your budgets, they were building White City, Media City, Woodland, buildings that in the end lasted, in some cases, less than 10 years at huge expense to, public money. And I always used to think the building, like when they sold Television Centre, they came up with all this spurious crap about, it's not fit for purpose. It's not, it was a social engineering exercise. They wanted to get a lot of the BBC out of London. And they did sort of say that too. But
yes, they did, yeah.
Actually, there was some terrible vandalism around what happened with Television Centre. I would have saved that over Broadcasting House. But in the end, I think it was either or, and they went with Broadcasting House. But you look at things now and the one show's done in a cupboard and so many shows look so cheap. And that's also partly because the people at the top, they don't see the value of having shows like that in TC4 or, done, as I would think, properly with real kind of production values. And I think the other thing that got thrown away was this enormous culture of expertise, brilliant designers, and lighting directors and this sea of talent. And yeah, you had some deadwood, maybe 10% of them were past it or couldn't give a shit, or who were very young and up and coming or whatever. But there was still a core of this incredible, and you could walk around those circular corridors at Television Centre. Certainly I did when I was a young fledgling director, and I'd be shitting myself because the studio was coming up. And I'd think, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm really worried, but I don't want to ask my producer because that will show that I'm feeling the fear. So I'd scuttle off into the main block, get a coffee, and then you'd bump into someone, what are you working on? And then they'd say, and I'd say, oh, I've got a bit of a problem. And the generosity and the sharing and the, you can only do that in a kind of collegiate community place. And that has absolutely gone. I mean, the industry is just not like that anymore. And the final thing I'd say is the other thing is I'm an old fart. So there is an element, I suppose, of thinking, but not completely, because I'm aware that there were things that were not great about the old days too. And there are things that are good about now. So, you do get the rough with the smooth. But in terms of your question about management, I think generally speaking, the management of the BBC has never been that great, if I'm honest.
Thank you for that. That's brilliant, because it's always been something that I've often thought about and thought, same conclusion as you. They've never been that great. It seemed to me that they never really understood gold mines when they sat in it. And I think sometimes that can work to today, but that's okay. I want to now move on, of course, to the other legend that we're talking about today. Another huge industry giant, the one and only Miss Biddy Baxter, who was a name for generations of children in Britain, was always known. This lady was massive, wasn't she? We knew the name Biddy Baxter because we saw it twice a week on the end credits of that legendary BBC show, Blue Peter. Now, you are an ex-editor of this show as well. You did your bit on Blue Peter. You were there for quite a while behind the scenes and then as the editor-in-chief as well. So you would have got to meet Biddy. Was that what got you writing this wonderful book about her and appreciating her?
Well, really, it was Edward Barnes, who had been
another name.
Yes. Well, the key producer on the early Blue Peter, but then became head of children's programs. And this is the man who invented Newsround and Swap Shop and what have you. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. And really, he was brilliant. And so going back to management, he was brilliant because he'd come from a creative background. He understood the audience. He understood popular telly. And he understood about letting people get on with it. So even though he'd have an idea like Swap Shop, he'd then hand it to Rose McGill and say, you run it, you do it your way. With Grange Hill, he let Anna Hume and Phil Redmond, he just saw his role as commissioning it and then defending it if it was a success. And boy, did he have to defend Grange Hill. And it was Edward who I got to know as well as Biddy, because he always retained a great affection and interest in Blue Peter. And he very kindly said to me, he said, he said, Biddy and I always used to talk like Mrs. Thatcher. Are they one of us? Do they understand how Blue Peter works. And he said, we clocked that you did. And so that was high praise from him. So we kept in touch, and we'd have lunch and so on and so forth. And it was one of these lunches with Biddy and Edward where he had brought up this. He said, no one's ever written your biography, Biddy. And that's an omission that should happen, and Richard would be the perfect person to do it. And her immediate reaction was, bollocks to that, darling. And then she said, it would be as boring as old boots. And I was in hysterics. But really, of course, I said to her, I think you're worried it'll be too interesting, not too boring. And I was at that point kind of, I'm not sure I'd want to take this on, because when you get to know somebody, I had encounters with John Nathan Turner. I met Verity once, but I was able to be very detached about both of them. But with Biddy, I thought, how am I going to make sure I keep that essential detachment when I know her, And I didn't want to be there. That's my leaving do, where she's about to give me a gold badge. She was an extraordinary force of nature, as we all know. And the last thing you want to do, you want to honor that and pay tribute to that. But I also knew she was a real person, and like all real people, like I started this conversation, everybody has flaws, everybody has blind spots. She certainly had her share of those. And the great blessing was eventually when I decided to write it, and I said to Biddy, I think I'm going to do it. What's your view? And she said, so long as it's accurate and balanced, a classic BBC producer, kind of through and through. She said, I will let you have full access to my archive, which is an incredible archive. She's her and her mum kept everything from the tiniest school report onwards.
Wow.
So that was an amazing resource. But she never interfered. She said, I won't have right of veto or right of reply. I had two independent people who were close to Biddy read it as well, to get further kind of, and they actually just picked up generally sort of minor lapses of timing or fact or whatever, things you do need to check. Boring stuff, really, admin-y stuff, rather than nobody said, oh, we're barking up the wrong tree here, or that's a very unfair, and there are lots of tricky stuff in there. She had lots of battles. She had her share of enemies. She had lots of people who were skeptical about her. But of course, she also had plenty of people who owe her their career, who learned from her. And she was an inspirational leader at a time. And I worked for Esther Ranson. I never worked for Biddy, except as a sort of floor assistant, which is a very junior role. But Biddy's values were so in Blue Peter that if you worked on Blue Peter in my time, you were still partly signing up to honor those values. I mean, all the phrases like, where's the close-up, darling? Say it, see it. That was our phrase. There's no point talking about rats if you haven't got lots of gruesome close-ups of rats. Children like detail. And if you're going to tell them a story, it has to be backed up with really good production values. And, the other thing she said was, if you're doing a light entertainment item in the studio, it's got to be as good as something that would be on Anton Deck's Saturday Night Takeaway or Top of the Pops or whatever. So I loved that. And that is something that has been eroded because of the lack of money and things. You can't do that on tuppence nothing a week. But in my day, we had a lot of, we had a big budget. We never felt it was enough, of course, but we were able to think in big, ambitious terms. So charting Biddy's life was fascinating, not least because she did give everything to her career. She was not interested in domesticity. She didn't want to be a wife and a mother. She wanted to have her career. She had a wonderful life. Let's not make any bones about this. I knew from my own experience of running Blue Peter that it's probably the best job in television. It has such a range and a variety of stuff you can do. It's endlessly challenging and interesting. And I think she never tired of it. The extraordinary thing was I did it for 4 years and was shattered. And one of my predecessors, Lewis Bronze, he did it for 8 years, and he said to me, I was absolutely worn out at the end of it. Biddy did it for nearly 26 years and would have carried on if Anna Hume hadn't sort of got rid of her. And I think in a way, though, that turned out to be good, because Biddy recognised, she's a realist. She recognised that the programme, if it was going to continue, it needed to be handed on before it was too late, because if she'd lingered on and stayed there, till she was 60 or whatever, by the point she left, it needed a fresh pair of eyes. And I think she would acknowledge that herself. And she was thrilled that it was her deputy Lewis, and then another of her producers, Oliver, was the next editor. Then it was Steve Hocking, then it was me, and we were all people who were there. We all are: Steve Hocking, Oliver McFarlane, Biddy, me, Edward Barnes, and Lewis Bronze.
That's a lovely picture, by the way, Richard.
Yeah,
Absolutely gorgeous.
That was taken in 2005, and we had a kind of, occasionally you'd have these. It's just like a family, Blue Peter. It's an extraordinary dynasty of people, and you come together at various points, and you share your war stories and your horror stories and all the rest of it. But and it's mutually supportive. And that was one of the great things about it. It was a BBC dynasty. Doctor Who is too, but Doctor Who so fundamentally changes its production team along the way that you tend to have less of that continuity, whereas Blue Peter had this sort of baton being passed on, and so you always had common ground. And Biddy was the matriarch; she was the queen.
She certainly was. I mean, I love the fact that everything here, there are links to the 3 books you've got here. Yes, we've got the beginning of Doctor Who. We've got the end of the original series of Doctor Who. We've got Verity as a trailblazer. We certainly have Biddy Baxter as a trailblazer. I mean, the stories are legendary about Biddy's time on Doctor Who, that huge on Blue Peter, that huge stint from all the various families of presenters she put into the roles. They are utterly legendary. And I like to think as well that, when it comes to Biddy, she came to Blue Peter. Actually, we should explain to anybody who's outside the United Kingdom. Blue Peter is the longest running children's television program in the country, if not the world.
In the world.
It is in the world, isn't it, Richard? And it's been going since 1958, October 1958. It was launched as a 15-minute show to children across the country who happen to have a television, and it's grown and it's grown and it's grown and it's grown, and it's now, like Doctor Who, it's become a part of British culture. The Blue Peter badge, of which you can see Richard is wearing his very proudly there. Ta-da! Looks like this. This, what are you saying? Now he's showing off. This is the legendary gold Blue Peter badge, which he keeps waving in front of me at every given minute.
It's kept in its special box, you see. Doesn't come out very often. We keep that in this very secure place. The family's safe.
Yes, exactly. No.
I met the Queen. I was very fortunate to meet the late Queen at the tea party for the Blue Peter's 50th anniversary, and I was asked to hand her a copy of the book that I'd written about the show. And I thought, well, this is a bit weird because she's hardly going to start reading it. But they explained to me that the process was you hand the book over, you say, "Mom, may I present you with?" And she goes, "Yeah, thank you very much," and then hands it to an equerry. But as I handed it over, and she said, "Indeed, thank you very much," and handed it over to equerry, I couldn't resist saying, because we'd given her a gold badge when she visited the studio a few years before. And so I said, "Mom, do you have any idea where your gold badge is now?" And she went, "Yeah, I think it's at Windsor Castle, probably."
In the vault, where Silver Nemesis was.
Yes.
The doctor nicked it. I'll do this. These Blue Peter badges, again, are legendary in our country. They have been going since Biddy herself introduced them into the show. She wanted a more magazine-y type format. The show itself was always adult in what it presented to children as well. Generations have now grown up to it. You had to win one of these. You had to suggest to the Blue Peter team about doing something, or doing what they used to call a make, how you make something on the show. Children all over the country bought into this.
Can I just say, I'm so admiring your attempt to explain to anyone from abroad, because whenever we did a lot of filming overseas, and it was always really hard because almost no other country has a show like Blue Peter. People in America, they go, "Is it like Sesame Street?"
No.
So it didn't help in America that Peter is a rude word. So you'd say, "We're from Blue Peter," and they go, "Blue Peter? Blue Pizza?" And you go, no, not Blue Peter, Blue Peter. I remember in San Francisco, we were filming Matt and Simon playing a baseball game with the San Francisco Giants, and they'd offered to flash up on the big board, "San Francisco Giants, welcome Blue Peter." And they were a bit uncertain about this. I said, "Can we just put welcome BBC?" And I was like, "No, put Blue Peter. It means something good in Britain."
It does. It means a classic, iconic show. So I mean, it's been around for all this time, and Biddy was instrumental, of course, at the time of putting this format in place, and then she drove it for over 20-something years. I'm glad you said that she appreciated the fact that somebody had sort of suggested, "Come on, Do you think you're better?
Well, I mean, I think it is a very hard. I mean, I was shown the door too. I mean, I think I probably would have stayed a little bit longer. My original plan was to stay to the 50th because that seemed like a good point. And I know
Oh,
that
you were so close as well.
one of my successors, Ewan, he there I go. What's going on with that outfit? Anyway, I was probably got dressed in the dark, shall we be kind and say.
I love that set, by the way, as well. I love the sales and everything. This is well after my time, of course.
I did commission that set. I loved that set. I thought that set was really special. And Miranda,
very different to what I got. I'll tell you what, the ones I really, really remember are these.
Oh yeah, that's very brown and cream, isn't it? Very 1970s that. But the designer that we used, Miranda, she'd also done the Top of the Pop set. She was very good at. She did those beautiful lines and curves. And the Blue Peter set was always, whatever generation, it was a kit of parts. So because we would be in TC1, TC4, TC6, TC8, all of those studios slightly different dimensions and sizes, you needed to be able to kind of configure it in different ways. And so that was up to the director. And it also depended on who you had in the show. So some shows you might be doing a make, so you'd need the make table. But in other shows, if you had a band, you'd want a stage up. So it was part of the process, and it was lovely to be able to kind of mix and match and make it look slightly different, but always with the classic branding. And it was Biddy, you see, who was ahead of the game with branding. She understood way before anybody else got it, that if you have the badge here and the badge on there, where I'm doing the wrong way around, there, all of that, then that's reinforcing all the time. And she did that years before anybody else did it.
Oh, totally. I mean, this is what, nowadays in business, you'll get these brand executives and these experts that come in. It's very difficult to try and say to them, I grew up in a time when we had Blue Peter badges and Doctor Who. Because if anything, if you're a BP or a Doctor Who fan or both, like we are, about blooming branding, because these two iconic shows were giving us everything branded in a certain way. It's created careers like for people like yourself, for so many people, because of what the content was and inspiring.
The cycle of it is so interesting, because the last time I was at a Blue Peter event was for the 60th anniversary in 2018, and the BBC very kindly shipped us all the previous editors and the presenters on a train from London up to.
Is that this one?
Yes, that's that one. There
it is still. There's the iconic Blue Peter ship.
And that's with Zoe Salmon and Romana D'Annunzio, who was briefly a presenter in the 90s.
Was she hired just because she's got the name Romana, Richard?
Oh, I mean, you've got to ask the question, haven't you? I mean, who would have done it? I suppose maybe when we have a Tegan or we have a Nissa, you might be thinking there's a bit of a stitch up going on. But
or a K9.
Romana was actually wonderful. But we had K9 on Blue Peter several times.
I know. I know.
The Blue Peter dogs did not like K9. Shep really tried to take the tongue out of the. I remember John Noakes telling me that. He said, Shep really didn't like the mechanical dog. Anyway, we went up for this. We went up for the 60th anniversary thing, and there was we were there for the live show with all these past presenters, and Sophie Ellis Baxter sang on the show, and it was all very family.
I watched that one, Richard. I watched that one.
Well, that was, it was a great day. And then we went for a big dinner afterwards, which was great. And there were speeches and what have you. And then some of us who were still standing went to some dodgy club, and there was a private room, and there we were, catching up and sharing the gossip. But what was really interesting was that at various points, they seemed to me incredibly young, members of the production team were coming up and introducing themselves and saying, I just wanted to let you know. And one of them said to me, I watched that Doctor Who special you did on Blue Peter, and I was about 9 years old, and it meant the world to me. I recorded it, watched it again and again, and it felt like it was talking directly to me, and it completely inspired me to go into television, and that's why I'm working on Blue Peter now. So thank you. So those sort of stories, and that's not the only example of that. And so when you get that kind of feedback, and you remember that was you as well, it's like the Take That song, Never Forget, it's someone else's dream. And one of the things that's wonderful about Doctor Who and Blue Peter is that they have this cyclical pass the baton on thing that goes through the generations, and it's available to anyone who really loves it. And I think that's really special.
It really is, because it is very difficult trying to explain to anybody that is not British in the UK how ingrained these two giants of television are now. They are amongst with that, and I would say Corrie as well, the longest running shows in the United Kingdom. They are in our history. you know, and there are certain things like the now legendary line, here's one I made earlier, is very similar to the line, it's bigger on the inside. I mean, the impact of these shows has been huge. And again, Biddy with Blue Peter recognized Doctor Who, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, before anybody else did. She knew the impact of this show. She knew a good show when she saw it, because she was one of the first to bring the Daleks on, wasn't she, on Blue Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she knew, because the job of being on Blue Peter is twofold. You introduce the audience to things they know nothing about. So long as you can find an angle that children will find interesting. So you might do an item about Queen Victoria's underwear, and you're literally holding up these enormous bloomers and saying, can you believe these were worn by the Queen of England, blah, blah, blah. And they know nothing about Queen Victoria. They don't really care. But you find a quirky way of getting into the story, and then they'll follow it. The other side of the thing is that you go with things that are catnip to the audience, that they absolutely love. So whenever there was a toy craze, for instance, in my day, there were things called Beyblades. And I commissioned the woman who came up with the makes, the genius who came up with the makes, to make a Beyblade stadium that kids could play these toys on. And, the ones you bought in the shops cost, 40 quid or whatever, but you could make this and the point of the makes was to have the fun of the making, even if, it was cack-handed and you didn't do a great job. In the end, more than half the fun was the gluing and the sticking and the making the mess.
Yes.
Biddy got, the Daleks took off. And so very early on, there were how to make a Dalek cake, kind of any item that was. And then I think there was also, of course, the fact that you had the crossover with Peter Purves, who'd been in Doctor Who. Yeah. So, that was occasionally a reason to dig out a clip. The Doctor Who items were, I think, as much driven by the fact that, remember, 4,000 kids were writing in a week to Blue Peter in the 70s. And a lot of them would have been watching Doctor Who, and they'd have said, well, we want to see, one of the things they used to say was, we want to see a clip from something, because there was no video recorder. So if you missed the show, so sometimes they would construct an item that would enable them to show a few clips. I think they did that for the anniversaries. So everybody won, and it was promoting another top BBC show. So why not?
And that was always the magic of BBC back in what I call the golden age, the age that I grew up in, the 70s and 80s, and was so inspired by a lot of the BBC shows back then, because they would support each other. And that was the fun of it, when you got those.
They would support each other like this. I mean, it has to be said that Blue Peter and Tomorrow's World were never very good friends, because they were always competing for the same studios and the same outdoor space. So Biddy would want a load of guardsmen in the Horseshoe car park, and Tomorrow's World would want to demonstrate a futuristic robot. But Biddy would always win, because she'd just phone up the controller of BBC One and say, "Now, Bill, darling, there's a little problem. Could you sort it out? Bye." And he would sort it out. So, this was the thing with Biddy, is like Verity. She had an ability to just cut. She would go straight to the top for a start, which is, as they always say, is the best thing to do. And because there were so few women around, and Biddy had a kind of dominatrix side to her that a lot of those kind of posh white Oxbridge men respond to. So she would sort of nanny them into submission. Yes. I mean, Michael Grade told me that, and Michael Grade is a proper showman and plenty of ego there in Australia. He was controller of BBC One, and he said he came up with this genius idea that Tomorrow's World and Blue Peter, rather than having a separate studio each on a Thursday, they could share a studio. So Blue Peter would go out live at 5, and then 3 hours later, Tomorrow's World would go out live, and everyone would save lots of money, and everyone would be friends forever. And this is not how Biddy saw it. And she said, as Michael Gray said, he said, "Oh my God." He said, "I never encountered another producer who was so determined that this was not going to happen." And he said she would come and find me wherever I was. And she's, "Now, Michael," and she would bring a plan of TC1 and say, "Look, you want us to fit into this studio that doesn't do the maths, it doesn't work." And in the end, he capitulated, and she absolutely got her way. And that's how she did it. And it was very, very clever. She also used to always send copies of the Blue Peter Annual to all the executives she knew had children. And, that kind of sort of puts you in the good books, because, and also it's a great way, because top management very rarely watch any television. They watch the news. They watch the news, but they don't watch actual television. And the Annual was a very great distillation of everything so they could flick through that in 5 minutes and feel like they were up to date on the world of Blue Peter, and all was good with the world.
She was so. I love her even more listening to you. I really do, because she was one of those icons for me as a young boy, and then growing into my teen, because you just knew the name. You knew that this show was her show. That you were in solid hand. I mean, I remember when it was announced that she was actually stepping down and she was leaving. There was something that actually happened, I think, to a whole generation. Because you know,
Yeah. Yeah, well, it would have been like the Queen abdicating. I mean, the great thing about Biddy, one of the things I love about her, I always used to call her Miss Marple on acid, because she had this very sort of, she would present as very ladylike and very, quite posh, really. But
yeah.
she could swear like an absolute trooper. And it
No,
was,
she couldn't.
she could. And she would use the toughest words going. And also, she had a wonderful line in put downs. I mean, everyone, including me, no one was too kind of senior to feel the force of a Biddy put down. But my absolute favorite was every summer we would have a garden party to celebrate the end of the season. And we'd invite, people from museums, the RNLI, people who'd helped the show out, friends of the program, as well as the production team. And we used to invite former editors and things. So Biddy would come back and be part of the guests in my time. And there were various people on the production team who were desperate to meet her because she was so iconic. And I was chatting to her once, and it was we always held them in the Blue Peter Garden if the weather was good enough. And it was quite nice, a glass of BBC wine, brackish BBC wine, and a pinwheel sandwich. And we'd be chat. And I could see this young assistant producer hovering, because he was desperately trying to find his moment to go, "Oh, hello, Biddy. I'd really like to say hello," and all of that. And I kind of stepped back to let him join the little group. And Biddy was very tall, is very tall, and always wore high heels, and slightly young, and her heels were sinking into the grass. And she took a step back and kind of stumbled backwards into this poor young man. And she looked at him and she said, "Oh, I thought you were a dog."
Oh, God.
So he was well and truly put in his place.
Oh, I feel for him. I would have melted.
He did.
Oh,
he
bless
did.
him.
He beat a hasty retreat. I can swear he had his metaphorical tail between his legs. But Biddy just had these one-liners. I invited her to a think tank at the BBC. We had to do these ghastly things where you'd get people together to brainstorm the future of the show, and they were largely exercises in hot air. But I said to Biddy, just for the,
I love your honesty,
I said to her, "Why don't you come along? It'd be quite fun to see your generation meet the generation I work with." And so we were in one of these kind of glass walled offices at the BBC that are etched with things that say "inspire," "educate," all that nonsense. Anyway, there we were sitting with our cappuccinos, and somebody started saying very earnestly, "Well, I have a concept." And Biddy just cut right across and said, "Anyone can have a concept, darling. Can you actually make decent television?"
Woo!
And the thing is that she was a great one for common sense. It was like, if it doesn't work as an item on television, don't waste my time. And she would not dress it up. So if she thought people were coming up with excuses or what, and lots of people do come up with, "Oh, we can't get that, or we can only get this," and she'd say, "No, darling, I want the entire collection in the studio for 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Go and do it." And usually people were so scared of her that they would then achieve the impossible. And then she'd say, "See what you can achieve, darling, if you just try hard enough."
Oh, she's fabulous. We need more of that today. More of that attitude today in all sectors, all industries. We've got to get that back. That is just a wonderful thing. Oh man, I do love your honesty, and thank you very much for being so frank on this. One of the things I want to talk about with yourself is that Biddy obviously had a lasting impression on you, because when you became the editor-in-chief on Blue Peter, I was a little bit old for Blue Peter at this particular point, but you would see it occasionally.
You're never too old for Blue Peter.
Oh, I love that. He's still selling it, and God love you for it.
I always thought it was a truly cross-generational program. You absolutely had grandparents watching with their grandchildren. You had students watching, when they were not supposed to be, well, they should be doing work. You had a whole cross-section, and I thought that was really healthy.
I would totally agree, because when you would, if you were off work for whatever reason, and you would come across Blue Peter, as I did during some of your era, you were back in it within seconds. It took you right back to where you'd left off. So I saw some of yours. It was a time when my memory is quite hazy now, but it's a real case of being able to no, don't. I recognize this show.
I took earlier, eh?
Behave yourself. You're not getting any controversy on this show. Stop that immediately. But it was, I mean, the magic was there. It was the familiar show. It was basically, you got back into the group. This was Blue Peter. You knew where you stood. You recognized the format. And one of the additions I had to watch, of course, you carried on so much of Biddy's legacy, but also the fact that when Doctor Who returned, Blue Peter was there. And that, for me, was so spot on right. I thought, yes, they haven't forgotten. There it is there. And that welcome back, if you like, from Blue Peter to the other show, welcome back to the channel, was just incredible. And it's gone from strength to strength to strength.
It's interesting because, I mean, I knew that as soon as I heard it was coming back, of course, I wanted to support it. Yes. But really, it was Russell and Phil Collinson came to my office for a meeting, and they said, we want to really do lots of big stuff with Blue Peter. And what do you think? And I was like, obviously, straight away, yes, definitely. And Russell said, yeah, and he said, we want to do the Designer Monster competition. And I said, yes, but it's got to be a monster that actually is in Doctor Who, because the one they did in the 60s didn't end up in the programme. So I said, that
was a shame, wasn't it, Richard?
I kind of don't, Biddy couldn't remember. I did ask her about it, but she couldn't remember why that didn't happen, because it seemed unusual. Usually, if Blue Peter viewers designed the Christmas stamps, they were the actual Christmas stamps. So it seemed very weird in that case that they didn't actually end up in the programme. Anyway, we said, okay, if that's the deal. Russell said yes. And I said, also, I want every possible guest combination we can have. Can Chris Eccleston come on? Can Billy Piper come on? And when I knew that they were going to do the Sarah Jane spin-off, I said we couldn't do Torchwood because Torchwood was post-Watershed. And also I thought quite rubbish. But, Sarah Jane was fab. And, obviously was aimed fair and square at our audience. And I remember that day that Liz Sladen came in. It was just wonderful. And I'm really annoyed with myself. I'm not a great one for, let's take a photo or any of that. Certainly never been into autographs. But I really wish I'd had my photo taken that day with Liz Sladen. Because she was so gracious, and it was so lovely to meet her in that context and know that she didn't seem, well, I don't think she was acting. She seemed to be very modest, and, they'd just done the pilot and they were clearly going to do a series and it was clearly going to be good. And yet she was sort of being very reticent. Maybe it was actors' superstition, let's not jinx it.
Maybe.
But I just thought, it was so clever what they did with her, marrying the old Doctor Who with the new generation, the new style of doing things. And it was so charming. So I was absolutely, in the last big Doctor Who competition we did a winner party, because Russell said, how can we top the monster? And I said, well,
I forgot about that.
What kids would want more than anything is to actually be in Doctor Who. And they had to go away. He went and talked to Andy Pryor, the casting director, and they came back and said, okay, we will go with this, providing Russell will write the episode that has the part in it. And of course, Russell wrote an episode where the kid gets decapitated and turned into the master. But that was hilarious. But we didn't know that at the time. But when we did the competition, we had the top 10 kids audition in the Globe Theatre. And I was a judge, Andy Pryor was a judge, and Annette Badland was the other judge. Yes. And the standard was really good, really high. And of course, we constantly brief these kids, only one part is available. But, I learned something that day, that you really can't tell kids of 10 or 11 that, they might not win. They don't hear it. They don't get it. So when we told them who'd won and who hadn't won, the disappointment, the tears, it was awful. It was awful. It was painful. And there were some fairly agitated parents, which I totally got. And I phoned Russell and said, look, it's a bit of a nightmare. I feel like we've maybe made a mistake in the way that we've gone about it. Is there anything you can do? And he did offer, I think it was another 3 kids runner-up prizes where they could come and be extras in the same episode. Right. And that was that's such a typically generous, kind thing that he did. But the boy that we chose, John, has gone on to be a really successful actor, and he's now one of the regular cast of Outlander. And he messaged me on Twitter a while ago, and a really lovely message, and just sort of basically saying you took this little Scottish kid and you changed his life, because that opportunity, he said, if that hadn't come along, probably everything else that followed wouldn't have happened in that way. And, you know, it's things like that even years after you've left, they're still really powerful.
Oh, totally. And that's the brilliant thing about this. I mean, there's a career that's been made. And these two shows, and I'm going to say again, they are legendary BBC shows, part of our furniture in the UK. They have created so many opportunities for people. They've been so inspiring over the years. And it's great to see as well that thanks to Blue Peter and you and your team welcoming the show back to the network back in 2004 for 2005 and getting all these opportunities and working with the production, it's still going to this very year. Here we are in 2023, the 60th year of our beloved Time Lord, and Blue Peter is still there. I've been clambering for one of these. I've been tweeting, I've been emailing various people. I have no idea who they are. They don't know who I am, saying, please, can I have one? And the answer is no. But they have just done the traditional Blue Peter Doctor Who crossover competition, where young viewers today under the age of 15 could actually take part in a Blue Peter competition, and the prize is an exclusive set tour, which viewers, of course, won't get to see until the anniversary year of November, because the winners get to see the new TARDIS set, the lock set. They get to go and see the new set. That's Ncuti Gatwa will be running around madly, I am assuming, next year. What a gorgeous prize! And then they have to be very quiet about it until Blue Peter decides to put it out one Friday. I think it's on now, isn't it, Richard? In November.
That's a massively exciting kind of thing, isn't it? Kind of an opportunity of a lifetime. Wonderful.
And it's traditionally Blue Peter as well. It's recognizing its audience. I was thrilled when I heard about that, because it just seemed right. And like Blue Peter was 60 a few years ago, and it had its gorgeous own little diamond badge. Again, I didn't get one of them, but this as well. He pays. I'll talk to you later. But there's this thing here as well. I mean, this is just so right, isn't it? It just matches.
I've not seen that. That's the first time I've seen that. Yeah, it's very cute. That, I mean, badges of all shapes and sizes, but that iconic ship shape, the little that logo there. That's with the Blue Peter logo in the O. It's wonderful.
Yeah. It works beautifully, doesn't it?
Really does.
Really does.
I quite like one of those, but I should think there's very slim chances of either of us getting hold of one, because we're too old. We're not the target audience.
But it is true. It is true. But I am thrilled for this next generation under 15-year-olds who got, and apparently yet again, as is the tradition, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young people have entered this competition. I did actually get a lovely email.
We had 47,000 entries to the Doctor Who Monster competition. And again, that was at a time when people were saying, oh, not that many kids. It was the summer. People going, oh, kids are on holiday. They're not going to be watching. They're not going to be. I mean, that tells you a lot about Doctor Who's popularity, but also Blue Peter's.
Totally.
We had to go through everyone. Everyone had to be looked at. And we did the judging at Russell T Davies's house. Where at that time, I don't think he's got it anymore, but he had a Dalek at the foot of the stairs, which was slightly off-putting when you arrived in the hallway, because it was sort of standard 1930s house, and there was this Dalek. But, we had such a laugh, and we were very torn, because the Absorbaloff, which won, but there was also Sad Tony, and we all loved
Sad Tony.
we loved the idea of a monster that was basically, if you touched it or it touched you, you die of sadness.
Oh.
I mean, that was exactly straight away. And the whole thing about, would the story reveal why Sad Tony was so sad?
No.
Maybe it's because he didn't get the Doctor Who crossover badge.
That's it. That is probably absolutely it. But as part of my asking a few questions about in preparation for meeting you today on the show, I have actually emailed the current Blue Peter production team over in Salford. It's so weird saying they're over in Salford. I'm sorry, call me old-fashioned.
Well, I've been there over 10 years.
Yeah, shush. And then and then they come back. They sent me a lovely email back, because that's how it's all done now, and it was fantastic. But they said they were delighted to confirm that they have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of responses to this beautiful competition. Isn't it just? It just shows again the strength of the two shows. It means as well there's another generation who are possibly coming to the next episodes for Doctor Who. It's a very lovely time for both shows there, but it's just fantastic to celebrate this with all these wonderful things, and certainly to celebrate as well with your 3 books in the celebratory year.
Obviously,
Yeah, drama and delight, the life and legacy of Verity Lambert, the woman who made Blue Peter, Biddy Baxter, and Totally Tasteless, the life of John Nathan Turner are all available right now for you. And you can get them from 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. Wow, what a chat. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so, so much for joining me on Whose Views Merchandise Paradise. I'm absolutely chuffed. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed yourself.
I have. It's gone in a flash. Thank you so much.
It really has, yeah. And also, have a great 60th anniversary of Doctor Who year. Enjoy the up and coming episodes because I know you're going to be watching.
I will.
And if you ever want to review them, give me an email. Come and.
Well, I might have to be more tactful than I've been today.
Possibly, yeah.
But I have to say, the genius that is Russell T doesn't tend to let you down. He's such a clever man. And the thing I love about him, and always have loved about him, is his deep felt passion for this show. You know, he's got the talent, but he's also got the absolute just love of it, and that's what makes the difference. That's what adds the magic.
Yeah, and as you were saying earlier, that's what adds the magic and to the actual production value as well of the shows. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but I know you are busy. I know you've got other things to do. Thank you so much for being with us. Please like the video. Please share the video. Please subscribe to the channel. All these lovely things that we have to say on YouTube. Yes, do all that. It's marvelous. We're brilliant. And join us as well for another edition of anything that's going on this channel on Whose Views. It's great to see you. Thank you again to Richard. See you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.